We continue now at the top of Daf Kuf Beis Amud Aleph and Meseches Bava Kamma. This is Bava Kamma Daf 102a. On the previous Amud, the Gemara is discussing which kinds of wood do we apply the laws of Shemitah to, and which kinds of wood do we not apply those laws. And on the previous Amud, the Gemara asked specifically about Eitzim de Mishchan, which is translated as oily wood. The point is that's the kind of wood that you're using for the light. That kind of wood, as you consume it, you're getting benefit. Generally speaking, we would say that Shvius should apply to something which, as you're consuming it, you're getting benefit. But Rava says that is not the case because we apply the following rule: Stam Eitzim lahasaka hinomdim. That in general we assume that wood is to be used for fuel. Fuel is something that, as you're consuming it, you're not getting the benefit because you're converting the wood into coals, and that's why we say since most wood is used in that fashion, therefore the laws of Shemitah do not apply. And Rashi explains, Stam Eitzim lahasaka nitnu, generally wood is used for fuel. V'lo lohair, it's not used for light. Hilkach Eitzim nitnu, therefore it's all under the category of Eitzim of wood, even when you're talking about the Eitzim de Mishchan, the oily wood. Umeikara lo chol alayu shvius, and therefore the rules of Shmius, the rules of Shvius rather, are not going to apply. Avol sefiche stim stamon l'tzvia. However, when you're talking about the sefiche stim, that was a particular kind of wood the Gemara was dealing with on the previous Amud, which is used for dyeing materials. So that generally is used for tzvia. It's used for dyeing. Hilkach chalalayo kedusha. Therefore, on that kind of wood, the kedusha shvius is chal v'asirei la'achar habir af lahesek, and therefore it's going to be prohibited after you consume it. Even if you're going to use it for fuel, that prohibition will still apply because that's what that kind of wood is generally used for. And finally, you have some kinds of wood that are in between. V'alei konim ugefanim. Let's say you have the leaves of reeds and the leaves of vines. Yesha ochlenosan. Some people eat those. V'yesha masikenosan. Sometimes it's used for fuel. And when you have something that could go either way, hilkach basar machsheves lakita azlina. Therefore, in those situations, it just goes by the intent of the person as he's collecting that particular kind of wood. And the Gemara continues. Amar Rav Kahana says, "Ve'etzim lahasaka tanahi." This issue of whether wood automatically is considered to be for fuel, that's actually a machlokas tanoim. Rashi explains, Tanoihi ikol mandamer stam eitzim lahasaka nidnu. There is one mandamer that says, like Rava just said, that in general we assume that eitzim are used for fuel. V'lo chai l'shviyas afilu ha'eitzim demishchan. If you hold like that, the rules of Shemitah will not apply even on the oily wood. V'ikol manda lesle, and there's the other mandamer doesn't hold that in general we say that eitzim are lahasaka, and therefore the nafkamina va'eitzim demishchan miyachayla. So then if you have eitzim demishchan, again that's the kind of wood that is oily wood that's generally used just for creating light. So then the rules of Shvius would apply on that kind of wood. That's a machlokas tanoim as follows. The Tanya, as we learned in a brisa, ein mosrin peiros Shvius, you're not allowed to give over the fruits of Shvius. Lo lemishra, not to soak flax, v'lo lechvusa, and not to launder clothing. That's a prohibition according to the Tana Kamma. Rabbi Yossi says, nosrin peiros Shvius l'soch hamishra, you are allowed to use the fruits of Shvius for the soaking of flax, or l'soch hachvusa, and for the laundering of clothing. And the Gemara says, my time of the Rabbanan, what's the reason of the Rabbanan? Because Amar Kra, because the pasuk says, la'achla v'lo lemishra, la'achla v'lo lechvusa. Again, the Rabbanan, who are strict, they understand the pasuk to mean that you're allowed to eat it, but you're not allowed to soak flax. You're allowed to eat it, but you're not allowed to use it to launder clothing. For Rabbi Yossi says, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, lachem for you, l'chol tzarchechem. It means it's for all of your needs. That's why Rabbi Yossi is lenient, and he says, in terms of soaking it for flax or laundering, it's going to be okay. It's going to be permissible. And Rashi explains, l'soch hamishra, again putting it into flax, means as follows: ein shorin pishtan biyayin shel shvius. Let's say you have wine of the Shemitah year, and you want to soak flax in that wine. You're not allowed to do that according to the Tana Kamma. V'chein ein mechabsin begodim. Similarly, you can't launder clothing in the same way. The havis schora, all of that is considered under the category of doing business with peiros shvius, which would be a problem. And so the Gemara now continues, v'rabbanan nami, but according to the Rabbanan as well, hachsiv lachem. What do they do with the pasuk of lachem, when Rabbi Yossi says lachem means lechol tzarchechem, and that's why Rabbi Yossi says that mishran kavus is okay. What do the Rabbanan do with lachem? They understand as follows: lachem dumya de la'achla. They compare lachem to la'achla, to eating, and what that means is as follows: b'misha hana'asa uviuro shavin, means to say that the only things that are going to be, that we're going to apply these rules of Shemitah, is if the benefit and the consumption is happening at the same time. Yatsu mishra chvusa, that would exclude the case of soaking flax and laundering garments. Shahana asan achar biyuran, because in that situation, the benefit comes after the time of the consumption, and that's why the Rabbanan are lenient in this case. It's considered that the benefit comes after, and therefore the rules of Shemitah do not apply. And again, the Rabbanan would actually say the same thing. When it comes to wood, we would be more lenient by something like Atzei de Mishkan. In such a situation, we would say, in general, if you have wood where the benefit is coming afterwards, even though Atzei de Mishkan, the benefit is coming at the same time, but since Stam Eitzim Lahasakahen, since most of the time wood is for fuel, therefore we're going to be more lenient, and we're going to say it's Hana'asan Achar Biuran. Rabbi Yossi Nami, and Rabbi Yossi also, Haksiv La'achla, doesn't it say La'achla? Why doesn't Rabbi Yossi say the same thing as the Rabbanan, that it should only apply to something that's Hana'aso Uviuro Shavin? And the Gemara says to that, Amar Lach, Rabbi Yossi will say to you, Hahumi Boile L'chiratanya, that pasuk where it says La'achla, that's used for the teaching in the following brisa. The Tanyas will learn in a brisa, La'achla v'lo l'melugma. It says La'achla and not l'melugma. L'melugma means you're going to use it as a dressing on a wound. So that's where Rabbi Yossi would apply this halacha. Atomer La'achla v'lo l'melugma. Now you're saying that it's La'achla v'lo l'melugma, and you're saying that we're going to be strict in that situation of a dressing. Maybe it should be La'achla v'lo l'chvusa, and we should be strict in a situation of laundering clothing. Kishuomer lachem, when it says lachem, hare kvusa amor. So that understands that we understand from there that laundering is okay. Hamani makayim la'achla v'lo l'melugma. So what do we do with the pasuk of la'achla? According to Rabbi Yossi, again, that excludes using these peiros shvius as a dressing for a wound. And the Gemara says, Umaru isa l'rabos hachvusa l'hotzias hamelugma. Now, why is it that we're saying laundering is okay, but a dressing for a wound is not okay? And to that, the Gemara explains, Mar b'aniyas hakvusa sheshava b'chol adam. We allow laundering because that's something that's equal for all people. Everyone does that. Umotzi aniyas hamelugma, but we exclude melugma, a dressing for a wound. She'eno shava b'chol adam. That's not something that's for everybody. That's only for people who are ill. And Rashi explains, Misha na'asu uviuro shava. Again, the rules of shvius only apply in a situation where the benefit is derived at the same time that the item is being consumed. Hanashi b'shashu kalam and olam. Again, the benefit is at the time that it's being destroyed from the world. So only in that situation, that kind of hana, do we say that you're then allowed to benefit from the peiros shvius only before the time of the biur, yatsu mishru chvusa. But this excludes cases of, again, soaking flax or laundering clothing. Shemishashim atilan pishton or beged biyayin. When you put the flax or the clothing, the garment into the wine, niskalkel, at that point it's already ruined. V'nivar, it's already consumed at that point in time. But the benefit is only 3 or 4 days later, until the flax is soaked, and again until the garment is laundered. And so now Rashi explains the machlokas tanoim. So this is the machlokas tanoim. The Rabbanan savri stam peiros la'achil. The Rabbanan hold that generally speaking, fruit is for achil, it's for eating. V'chaylo alayu kedusha shvius, and therefore the kedusha shvius is chal on peiros. Keda amron le'el, like we say earlier, the chol davar shanasu v'yiro shava, as long as the benefit and the consumption at the same time, chaylo, so therefore it's chal. Hilka chafilu likton lemishru chvisa, so therefore by fruits, even if they would be collected, let's say, for the purpose of soaking flax or laundering, lo mahanya machshava lafkui suran, that machshava is not going to help to take away the isur lemahavi kali konim, that it should now be like the leaves of the reeds, shalikton la'etzim, which were collected as wood, the mishru, which are permitted, the hasam stamayu lahachi, because over there, that's generally what they're used for. Lahachi ulahachi, meaning over there, we say it could be used for this, it could be used for that, and already machshava could make a difference. It makes a difference what your intent is. Avol peiros, but when it comes to fruits, staman la'achila, so in general, it's meant to be eaten. Umishas yitzirasan chayil kedushasan, so when it's created from that moment already, it has that kedusha. V'su lo mahani machshava la'afkui, and therefore, the fact that you have a different intention isn't going to help. V'asur, and it's going to be asur, lemishra uchvis, it's going to be asur for soaking flax, for laundering as well. De'ein nenin b'kedusha shvius, you're not allowed to get that kind of benefit because you have this kedusha shvius. Ela hanod hadoma la'achila, the only kind of benefit you're allowed to get by kedusha shvius is going to be a hana that's similar to eating, and again, that's why it's going to be problematic. V'gabe eitzim nami, the same thing is true by wood. Stam eitzim lahasaka nitnu, in general, we assume most wood is used for fuel. V'lo chayla afilu ha'eitzim the mishkan, and so therefore, once you assume that most wood is going to be used for the purpose of fuel, therefore the kedusha shvius is not going to be chal, and that's true also ha'eitzim the mishkan. It's true over there as well on the oily wood. But Rabbi Yossi holds lo amrinan stam peros la'achila. We don't say that in general fruits are for achila. And therefore your intention does make a difference, just like we say by the aleikonim and the gefanim. So therefore, if you collected them for the purpose of soaking flax, let's say, so then we're going to say that's already considered something where the benefit is after you've already consumed it. And therefore, according to Rabbi Yossi, there's going to be no chalos of the kedusha shvius whatsoever in that situation. That's why Rabbi Yossi is lenient. Kach matzasi, that's what I found. Rashi says there are other ways to explain the Gemara, V'zu shamati, but I heard this explanation, V'hagan, and this is the proper explanation. And the Gemara continues, Kamma lahadetanya, who does the following brisa go according to? La'achla, when it comes to fruits with the kedusha shvius, one is allowed to eat it, v'lo l'melugma, but one cannot use it to dress wounds. La'achla v'lo l'zilaf, one can eat it, but one cannot use it to sprinkle, let's say, wine around the house, around the floor of the house, that was done to give a pleasant smell around the house. And la'achla v'lo lasos mimena apuktoizin, you're allowed to eat it. Again, fruits with the kedusha shvius can be eaten, but you can't use it to make an apiktoizin, which is something that helps to induce vomiting. And in any case, we see that all of these types of activities are excluded. And the Gemara says, Kiman Rabbi Yossi, who does this follow? This follows Rabbi Yossi. The Ikar Rabbanan, because if it was following the Rabbanan, Ikanami Mishru Chvusa, again, the Rabbanan said that also soaking flax and laundering, those are also prohibited, because we say in those situations as well, there is a Kedusha Shvius, and the Kedusha Shvius says that those activities as well are problematic. Rabbi Yossi disagrees. Rabbi Yossi says only Melugma and Ziluf and Lasos Mimena Apuktoizin, only those are going to be problematic, but Mishra and Chavusa, according to Rabbi Yossi, there would be no Kedusha Shvius at all. And Rashi says, Lazalif shemizalfin yayin bebayis. Again, Lazalif means that they would sprinkle wine around the house. V'hainami and shavim v'chaladim. This is also something that's not common. Just like malugma is something that's only for people who are sick, so too this is not for everyone. She'ein sarach ziluf el adam me'unag u'me'udan. Only somebody who's pampered would actually use wine to sprinkle it around the house. This is not something that's done by normal people. And then apuktoizin vishit lahake. Again, that's something that's used to induce vomiting. That's not for everybody. That would only be for specific people. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Rabbi Yehuda says, Im ashvach v'chulu, if the improvement of the wool is more than the amount that was spent. The machlokas there in the Mishnah was, let's say a person gives wool to someone to dye, he tells him to dye it red, and then the person instead dyes it black. So according to Rabbi Meir, that's the same thing as a shinoi kona, and we say in that situation, the person who dyed the wool is kona the wool, and he just owes what it was at that time that he was given the wool, meaning he only owes the value of the wool and no more. And Rabbi Yehuda says that's not the case. In this case, actually, the buyer has the upper hand, and he can take back the dyed wool, and he always pays the lesser amount. If what was spent was less than the improvement, he pays what was spent. If the improvement is less than what was spent, then he pays the improvement. Again, the buyer, in that case, according to Rabbi Yehuda, always has the upper hand. And the Gemara says, Yosef Rav Yosef Achorid Rabbi Abba Kamed Rav Huna. Rav Yosef sat behind Rav Abba in front of Rav Huna. V'Yosef Rav Huna v'Kamar. And Rav Huna was sitting and he was saying as follows: Halacha Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha. The halacha is like Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha. V'Halacha Rabbi Yehuda. And the halacha is also like Rabbi Yehuda. And the Gemara says, Zahadrinu Rav Yosef la'ape. Rav Yosef turned his head. It means to say that he turned his head in disdain. And Amar, he said as follows: B'shalom Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha. I understand why you say the halacha is like Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha. Itzrich, that teaching is necessary. Salkadai d'chamina, because one might have thought Yachid v'Ravim halacha k'Ravim, that you have a Yachid, an individual, against the Ravim, against the majority, so the halacha should be like the majority. So Kamash Malon, so he's coming to teach us halacha ki Yachid, that the halacha in this case is like Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha, it's like the individual. And the Gemara explains, Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha Mahi, what is this Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha that we are referring to? The Tanya, as we learned in a brayso, Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha Omer, Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha says, Milva b'shtar, when it comes to a loan that's in a document, so ein nifroin mehen, so that you don't collect from them. Rashi will explain. Milva al peh, but when it comes to a loan that is not in a document, it's a milva al peh, it was just a loan that was made with a guarantee orally, verbally, so then nifroin mehen, then you could collect from them, mimneshu kematzel miyadim, because in that case it's as if you're saving it from their hands. And Rashi explains, milva b'shtar ein nifroin mehen, when it comes to a milva b'shtar, we don't collect from them. This is referring to collecting from the non-Jews, means lifnei edein. It means we don't collect from them the loan before their holiday, the non-Jewish holiday, mimnei shesimcha hilo, because when they pay off their debts, that's something that makes them happy. V'yazlu mod la'akom b'yom chagam, and then what's going to happen is the non-Jew will go on the day of the holiday, and he will give hodah, he will give thanks to his idol, and that could be problematic, so therefore we don't allow them to pay off the debt debt right before their holiday. V'Rabbanan Savri also leporan v'lipara mehen klal. The Rabbanan hold it's completely forbidden. And again, Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha, he's making a distinction. He says when it comes to a milva b'shtar, so there you don't actually collect it from them before the holiday. But by a milva al peh, that you do collect from them, because since there's no document in that situation, we're afraid you may not get a chance to collect otherwise. Therefore, it's kematzel miyadim, is as if you're saving the money from them. Otherwise, they might end up keeping the money. And that's why Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha makes that distinction. And so in any case, therefore, it makes sense to say that the halacha is like Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha. Again, you might have thought the halacha is like the majority. El halacha Rabbi Yehuda lamali, but to say that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, that's the Rabbi Yehuda Nar Mishnah. Why does that even need to be said? Machlokas v'achar kach stamhi, because that's actually a situation where there's a machlokas in the Mishnah, and then it's followed by a stam Mishnah that says this halacha. Umachlokas v'achar kach stam. Anytime you have a machlokas and then a stam Mishnah, halacha kastam. The halacha is like the stam Mishnah, so it should be obvious that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda. There's no need for this to be said. And the Gemara continues and explains machlokas b'Bava Kamma. We find the machlokas in Bava Kamma. That's our Mishnah. Letzvoa lo edom v'tzavo shachar. Again, he gives him the wool in order to dye it red, and he dyes it black. Shachar v'tzavo edom. He gives it to him to dye it black, and he dyes it red. Rabbi Meir Omer nosin lo demet smaro. Rabbi Meir says he just gives him the value of the original wool that he was given. And Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says mashvach yeser al yitzia. If the improvement is, if that costs more than what was spent, nosin lo as yitzia, then he gives him the lesser amount. He gives him what was spent. Vim hayetzia yiseir la shevach, and if what was spent is more than the improvement, nosin lo as hashevach. Again, he gives him the lesser amount. He gives him just the shevach. And so that's the machlokas that we find in our Mishnah. Again, the machlokas between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. And then, ustam b'Bava Metzia, we find the stam Mishnah that goes like Rabbi Yehuda in Bava Metzia. The Tanan, as we learned in the Mishnah of Bava Metzia, Kol hamishana yado al hatachton. Anybody who changes from what they were supposed to do, they have the lower hand. V'chol hachozer bo yado al hatachton. And anybody who's chozer, who goes back on what the deal was, they also have the lower hand. And so that is the same exact idea. Here you have a situation where the person changed. He deviated from what was supposed to be done. He dyed it black instead of red, etc. And it's yad al hatachton. It's exactly Rabbi Yehuda's halacha that we say that the person who gave the wool, the person who's buying these services, he has the upper hand. The person who dyed it wrong, he has the lower hand. And so that's a stam Mishnah. It's a machlokas v'achar kach stam. So it's obvious the halacha should be like Rabbi Yehuda. Why does that even need to be said? And the Gemara says, Rav Huna, now Rav Huna will respond to that it does need to be said. Because it's necessary. Because one might have thought, Ein Seder LeMishnah, that there is no real order to the Mishnayos. And if there's no order to the Mishnayos, you don't really know which Mishnah came first and which came second. Ustam v'achar kach machlokasi. So maybe it's actually a stam Mishnah first, and then the machlokas. Maybe it's not a machlokas v'achar kach stam. In a situation of stam v'achar kach machlokas, that rule does not apply. But the Gemara continues with Rav Yosef, and Rav Yosef responds to that argument. If so, if you're going to make that argument of Ein Seder LeMishnah, and therefore you wouldn't necessarily have known that this was a case of machlokas v'achar kach stam, so kol machlokas v'achar kach stam, anytime you have a machlokas and then a stam Mishnah, namely we should say that you can't necessarily rule like the stam Mishnah. We should say Ein Seder LeMishnah. We should say there is no order to the Mishnah, and so therefore you're never going to have a situation of machlokas v'achar kach stam, because ustam v'achar kach machlokasi, maybe it's actually a stam, and then a machlokas, in which case we don't paskin like the stam Mishnah. And so therefore Rav Yosef says you can't make such an argument. And the Gemara continues with Rav Huna, and Rav Huna will respond to that. Ki lo amrin an ein seder leMishnah. When do we not say that there's no order to the Mishnah? That's b'chad Mesechet. If it's all in one Mesechet, so then Rav Huna says, then you're actually correct. Then you could say that it's a machlokas v'achar kach stam, and you can't make the argument of ein seder leMishnah. Aval betray Mesechtes, but over here, like a situation here with two Mesechtes, one Mishnah in Bava Kamma and one Mishnah in Bava Metzia, you're trying to argue that it's a machlokas v'achar kach stam. So there amrinan, there we say ein seder leMishnah, and you can't say that it's a machlokas v'achar kach stam. It might actually be a stam v'achar kach machlokas. V'Rav Yosef, and Rav Yosef will respond to that. Kula nezikin chad mesechti. The entire nezikin is actually considered to be one Mesechet. It's not considered two Mesechtes, and therefore, if it's one Mesechet, there is a proper order to the Mishnah, and you are able to say that it's a machlokas v'achar kach stam. V'iba is saying, and the Gemara says, if you want, I could say another answer. Mishum dekatani lo gabi hilchas subsikta. The reason why we know the halach is like the stam Mishnah in Bava Metzia is because that Mishnah actually, that line in the Mishnah is taught by a general areas where it's clear we're giving piskei halacha, hilchas subsikta, we're giving the final psak. Why is that? Because kol hamishana yadu al hatachtona, v'chol hachozer bo yadu al hatachtona. The Mishnah over there is saying anyone who changes has the lower hand, anybody who retracts has the lower hand. It's very clear from the context that we're giving final halacha, and that's how we know the halacha is like that stam Mishnah. And Rashi explains, that Stam Mishnah over there in Bava Metzia for sure is an Ikr Mishnah, meaning we hold like it. Because that's taught in Bava Metzia by other clear halachas that we paskin like. Because the topic is not even really relevant over there. The only reason that Mishnah is there is to give you some final halachas. That these are the final halachas that the Tana paskins together with the halach of Kol HaChozer Bo, where there's no machlokus about that, and so therefore it's clear that the halacha is like the Stam Mishnah in this regard. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Hanosein Mos l'shlucha, if somebody gives money to his agent, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Kuf Beis Amud Beis.